Why deep suffering transforms an anxious person forever. There is a type of emotional pain that does not just hurt an anxious person in the moment, it slowly rewires how they experience love, safety, and connection at the deepest level. It usually begins as overwhelming emotional intensity, where even small changes in someone's behavior feel like a signal of possible rejection or abandonment. Every thought becomes attached to fear, especially fear of losing someone they deeply care about, or becoming unimportant without warning. Even silence, delayed replies, or emotional distance starts feeling like danger instead of normal space inside a relationship. The anxious mind does not experience distance as calm space. It experiences it as emotional threat that must be fixed immediately. They begin overanalyzing messages, tone shifts, and small inconsistencies as if their entire emotional safety depends on decoding them correctly. What others see as a simple misunderstanding feels like a deep emotional rupture that could end the connection at any moment. This is because their nervous system has learned to associate love with unpredictability instead of stability or safety. And when this pattern continues for long enough, something inside the anxious person begins to quietly break under emotional pressure. At first, they respond by trying harder, giving more, explaining more, and emotionally investing even deeper to restore safety. They overgive, overthink, and overattach, believing that more effort will finally create stability in the relationship. But instead of calming their system, this constant emotional effort slowly increases anxiety and internal exhaustion. Because anxious attachment is not just about love, it is about trying to secure emotional survival through connection. And survival energy cannot relax in relationships that feel unpredictable or inconsistent over time. So the suffering deepens, and their emotional world becomes more reactive, unstable, and mentally exhausting. They start losing sleep, clarity, and the ability to distinguish between real signals and imagined fears. Every emotional reaction from the other person becomes amplified, turning small moments into intense emotional experiences. And slowly, they begin abandoning their own needs just to avoid the fear of being abandoned first. This is the point where deep suffering begins its transformation phase inside the anxious person, because the mind can only handle emotional chaos for so long before it starts searching for meaning inside the pain. Eventually, exhaustion sets in, not just physical, but emotional, where they no longer have energy to chase or over-explain everything. And in that exhaustion, something important begins to quietly emerge in their awareness. They start noticing patterns instead of only reacting emotionally in the moment. They begin recognizing how often they sacrifice their own stability for inconsistent emotional connection. They start understanding that anxiety is often created more by unpredictability than by love itself. This realization does not come from advice or theory. It comes directly from repeated emotional experience. Because deep suffering forces awareness into places where comfort and hope could never reach. And this becomes the first real stage of transformation. They begin questioning their dependency on reassurance, attention, and constant emotional confirmation. They slowly realize that even when love is present, their nervous system still struggles to fully trust it. A painful question begins forming again and again in their mind. What if the problem is not only the relationship, but the pattern of attachment itself? This creates the first crack in their old emotional identity and how they understood love. Now they begin observing their internal reactions instead of only blaming external behavior. And when someone starts observing their own patterns, real change finally becomes possible. As suffering continues, emotional fatigue increases, and reactions naturally begin to slow down. They stop reacting instantly to every emotional trigger, not because they are healed, but because they are exhausted. And in that exhaustion, clarity begins to slowly emerge. They start realizing that love should not feel like a constant emotional emergency. They begin understanding that attachment should not feel like repeated fear of loss. They even notice that peace was missing, even during moments that looked stable on the surface. This creates emotional confusion at first because their entire blueprint of love was built around intensity and pursuit. But now, that same blueprint no longer feels safe or sustainable internally. They begin withdrawing slightly, not from love itself, but from over-attachment and emotional overdependence. They start giving space where they once over-chased and over-explained everything. They begin observing behavior instead of reacting instantly, learning to sit with emotional discomfort. And this is where real transformation quietly begins to form. Because distance reveals what emotional intensity was previously hiding. They begin seeing who shows up without being chased or pressured. They notice who communicates with consistency, respect, and emotional maturity. They start valuing stability and safety more than intensity and emotional highs. And slowly, their definition of love begins to shift. Love is no longer just attention, reassurance, or emotional intensity. Love becomes consistency, emotional safety, and steady presence over time. This shift does not happen through advice, but through emotional experience and suffering. But awareness alone is not enough. Real change requires behavioral transformation. So they begin setting small emotional boundaries for the first time. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who do not listen or care. They stop chasing clarity from those who only create confusion. They begin protecting their emotional energy instead of constantly spending it. Each boundary strengthens their sense of identity and emotional stability. They realize they can survive emotional discomfort without collapsing. They learn that silence is not always rejection. Sometimes it is just space. They understand that not every delay or change in tone has hidden meaning. This reprogramming happens through lived experience, not theory or advice. Over time, they become less reactive and more observant in relationships. They stop confusing anxiety with intuition about love. They begin pausing before reacting instead of immediately chasing. And in that pause, real emotional growth begins to form. They still feel deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves for those feelings. And this is the true transformation deep suffering creates. Not emotional numbness, but awareness with boundaries and self-respect. Not the absence of love, but the presence of inner stability. And once an anxious person reaches this stage, they never fully return to who they were before. Because deep suffering does not destroy them, it teaches them how to finally return to themselves. When suffering finally turns into awareness, the anxious mind stops chasing and starts understanding itself. And in that moment, everything changes. Not the world around them, but the way they finally choose to stand within it.